Sunday's mass shooting at Bondi Beach has sparked fears of a rise in lone wolf terrorism in Australia, with authorities saying the two gunmen, Sajid Akram and his son Naveed, appear to have acted alone amid investigations into their motives. Lone wolf terrorism is when individuals carry out political violence without direct support or instruction from an established terrorist network. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese said the gunmen were likely inspired by Islamic State ideology after investigators found homemade ISIS flags in the trunks of the gunmen's car. Australia's intelligence agency, ASIO, has examined Naveed Akram for alleged IS links in 2019, though he was not deemed a threat. The father and son spent nearly a month in the Philippines before the attack, and they reported the southern city of Davao on Mindanao Island as their final destination. The region has previously been linked to Islamist militancy, and authorities say they're now looking into where the duo went, what they did, and why they went there. The Philippines has rejected what it calls a sweeping and misleading characterization of the country as an ISIS training hotspot. Some media reports suggested the suspects visited the Philippines to receive military-style training, though Australian authorities have not confirmed any such training. A spokesperson for the presidential office says there's no validated report that the gunmen involved in the Bondi Beach shooting received any form of terrorist training in the country. The Philippine Army also released data showing a sharp decline in local terrorist groups from more than 1,200 members in 2016 to 50 this year. Officials added there have been no recorded terrorist training activities, recruitment efforts, or large-scale attacks by domestic groups since 2016, and that terrorism threat levels in several parts of Mindanao have shifted from high to low. For more on this story, joining me now is Levi West, Research Fellow at Australian National University's Research School of Social Sciences, speaking with us from Canberra. Now, his research focuses on terrorism, counterterrorism, and radicalization. Dr. West, let's start with this. Is terrorism really shifting from big organized networks to individual attackers? And if it is, how should that change the way we define and fight terrorism today?
I mean, I think it's reasonable to say that since about the mid-2000s, most jihadist terrorist plots in the West, at least, have looked more like what we would call lone actor terrorist attacks than any kind of large-scale mass casualty, centrally organised terrorist plots. They still happen, but they're considerably rare by comparison. Some of your viewers can cast their minds back to the period where the Islamic State's so-called caliphate was functioning in Syria and Iraq, and the litany of Western-based inspired lone actor stabbings and vehicle rammings that happened. That is what much of jihadist terrorism looks like in the West in this day and age. That has dropped off significantly since the caliphate was substantially degraded by Western and Middle Eastern military efforts. And somewhat ironically, what has come to light over the past couple of days is that there is now some concern that these two operatives in Australia may have spent time with Islamic State elements within the southern Philippines, noting the comments from the Filipino government.
And we reported that the men accused of the Bondi attack had traveled to the southern Philippines, which did have a long history of Islamist militancy. We're hearing reports that there's no confirmed data as to whether they received that or not. But undoubtedly, we did hear that ISIS-linked groups are in places like Mindanao and Afghanistan. So does that mean smaller local hubs are now more important than any central command in shaping the global terror threat?
Yeah, in some ways. So if we recognise that Islamic State is highly operational in Northern Africa in relatively conventional insurgency ways with centralised hierarchical structures, they are waging an insurgency of very sophisticated and places successful insurgency in Northern Africa. But then beyond that part of the world, the two primary hotspots, the two primary places where there is some level of Islamic State activity is Afghanistan, and that is a sophisticated, demonstrated with external operations capability, Islamic State Khorasan in Afghanistan. And there is a smattering of what's left post the defeat of Islamic State's siege of Marawi in the southern Philippines. There remains a footprint of Islamic State operatives in southern Philippines.
And that footprint seems to be expanding outside of the regions you just mentioned. For instance, here in Asia, including Singapore, Do you think we're seeing the same move towards self-radicalized individuals? And how real is the risk of copycat attacks inspired by lone wolf incidents overseas?
I mean, the challenge is that in any terrorism confrontation, in any effort by a state to defeat a terrorist organisation, you can make substantial inroads and you can neutralise their most effective ideologue or preacher, and you can deal with their most effective leader, and you can deal with their best explosives expert. What you will always struggle to defeat and eradicate is the ideas that animate it. So for as long as everyone has access to the internet, people can go online and they can access content that is Islamic State or Al Qaeda or generally jihadist in nature, and it might happen to resonate with them. And if it does, then that's the sort of thing that can lead to what we would call self-radicalization. In reality, that's not self-radicalization. That's an organization producing propaganda that hopes that people would be inspired to engage in violence as a result of that.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned if anyone has access to the internet, these attacks are bound to occur. So what does the Bondi attack reveal about how radicalization has evolved in the digital age, particularly as we're seeing developing AI in the mix?
So we would need to see some data on exactly how these two individuals have come to engage with Islamic State's ideas. What we know is that Naveen, the son, the 24-year-old, had previously been investigated by our domestic intelligence service for linkages and affiliations and relationships with people who have subsequently gone on to be charged with terrorism offences. So that gives us a little bit of insight into his real-world connectivity to Islamic State. What we don't have any information on is how much content and propaganda and videos, etc., he was consuming. We would assume that he is consuming a large volume of that. What we know is that most of the jihadists who committed terrorist attacks through that 2014 to 2018 period were mostly on the receiving end of one-way traffic. So they were consuming propaganda, but for the most part, not having any meaningful relationship back to anyone who was actually a member of the Islamic State. It's different for people who are traveling as foreign fighters. They would build relationships, but for people who did attacks in the West, for the most part, they are just consuming digital content produced by Islamic State. And that's probably the best insight that we have into what radicalization looks like for most jihadists in the West.
Mm-hmm. Could we also factor in the element that the suspects here are thought to be father and son? What do we understand about the radicalization process within families?
So that's a slightly different and at times more challenging aspect of things. It's not unusual for siblings to be involved or, for broader familial networks of people to be involved. Fathers and sons is a relatively unusual dynamic for terrorism. What we know is that if radicalization is happening within familial networks, then it tends to increase the challenge that's involved in trying to penetrate that network from an intelligence perspective. If you've got a diverse range of people who are engaging in extremism and terrorism activity, then your ability to get into that network and shape it or disrupt it is much easier than if everyone who's involved in that network is related to each other. It's a much more tight-knit network. So that's a significant part of the challenge. And then beyond that, the father-son dynamic also adds a kind of there's a level of secrecy and familiarity that exists between family members that's different to general social network ties. So
a lot of elements that we need to be unpeeling here. But speaking of the many challenges, it's very difficult to detect lone wolf actors before they strike. So what are the most pressing challenges intelligence and law enforcement agencies must face when intervening, especially early to, as you mentioned, familial ties?
So I guess there are a number of challenges, but the first one, and I think this holds for counterterrorism capabilities right across the world, not just in the West, is that as I'm sure the Singaporean government and governments across Southeast Asia have done, is that as we've pivoted to strategic competition as our primary lens through which we think about defence and national security, counterterrorism is not the priority that it has been historically. So the first challenge is a funding and resourcing challenge of just having enough money and enough man hours and capability to be able to do the job effectively. The secondary challenge is one that sort of sits at the nexus between sort of security and democracy, which is that the further upstream you get in relation to your intervention, the less the person that you're intervening on has actually done. And that presents us a substantial challenge in terms of civil liberties and the rights of citizens in countries, etc., in relation to the fact that it's very, very challenging for a liberal democracy to take action against people who might do something in the future. And this is where sort of early intervention in a counterterrorism sense becomes a particular challenge, is making assessments, as we did in 2019 on Naveen, who perpetrated the attack on Sunday. In 2019, we assessed that he didn't present a threat of violence, and that was probably true at the time. 5-6 years later, we find ourselves in a very different set of circumstances. After he's committed the attack on Sunday, it's very easy for everyone to go back and say, well, we should have done something in 2019, except in 2019, he wasn't presenting with the things necessary to charge him with an offence or to put him onto an intervention program or a diversion program, whatever it might be. So there's substantial challenges in that regard.
And hoping that we could take a lesson from these challenges and find out what to do next in order to prevent anything like this from happening. Thank you so much. That was Dr. West talking to us from Australia.